Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. Today's program is held in connection with our newest exhibition, Playful Pastimes, exploring leisure activities in our region between 1890 and 1910. My name is Alexander Philippides, and I'm the Program Associate at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. At the museum, we're pleased to offer this program free of charge. We appreciate everybody's support however you are able, as we do not receive town, state, or federal funding. The museum is pleased to welcome Dr. Will Mackintosh, an associate professor at the University of Mary Washington in the Department of History and American Studies. Dr. Mackintosh has an academic focus in the history of leisure, the history of crime, and the cultural history of capitalism in 19th century America. He has written several publications on the topic of American tourism, including his 2019 Selling the Sights, the invention of the tourist in American culture. He's also working on a new project on the Loomis Gang, a gang of horse thieves from 19th century New York. I hope our viewers will join me in, again, welcoming Dr. Will Mackintosh. Hi, Dr. Mackintosh. How are you doing today?
Good. Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who's watching. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, we're very pleased to have you. So I guess we'll get right into it. We have a few questions prepared today, and then we'll go on later to see if the audience has any questions, and then we'll wrap up, and that's kind of how things will go today.
Okay.
So just to get started, we're kind of talking about tourism and leisure in the United States in this sort of era in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? So what would you say was changing, the greatest contributing factors to the rise of tourism in the United States during this period?
So, this is answer is going to sound kind of deceptively pat and simple, but I would say the rise of modern market capitalism across the course of the 19th century, which, is both huge and also vague way to explain it. So let me say a little bit more specifically about what I mean by that. Sort of my work, I'm really trying to dig into the origins of the idea of the tourist in American culture. And what I really found is that the tourist as a figure in American culture became a kind of distinct and identifiable cultural category in relationship to the rise of particular forms of kind of capitalist modernity that really begin in the 1820s and accelerate across the 19th century. And I identify a couple of different areas of kind of capitalist development that all work together to produce this figure of the tourist. And one is shifts in the publishing industry, the way in which publishers kind of package and repackage geographical information for new kinds of audiences. And that essentially what I found is that as sort of the American publishing industry got bigger and more integrated and more specialized and more developed across the 19th century, they began to produce, they had this economic incentive to produce new packaging for existing kind of geographical knowledge. And among the genres that they invented in that was the idea of the tourist guidebook. So all of a sudden there were sources of information about where to go on your leisure travel, on your holidays, that were kind of being prepared for you by these businesses that had an incentive to do so, to sell books in the marketplace. Then I look at the rise of sort of transportation technology, which is on some level, that's a thing that seems pretty apparent, right? That with the rise of the emergence of stagecoach networks around the turn of the 19th century, then a little bit later in the 18 teens and the 1820s, you get the development of steamboat travel and also canals being built in the 1820s. And then really in the 1830s and 1840s, you begin to see long distance railroad networks that those, enable leisure travel in a new way, right? A big impediment to leisure travel before that had really been just that it was slow and uncomfortable and expensive to literally travel through space. And those technologies all made it a lot faster. But more importantly, they made it sort of simpler, right? When you had to travel before the era of this sort of commercial travel, you were really on your own to figure out where to go and how to get there. It was very improvisational. If you read the diaries of 18th or century travelers or travelers at the beginning of the 19th century, right? They are really making it up as they go along, as they're trying to figure out how to get from one destination to the next to get to their ultimate destination. But really, in the beginning of the 1820s, you begin to see these transportation companies creating tickets, inventing like the modern idea of a ticket, right? Which is a company that's basically taken all that labor off of your hands. If you want to go from point A to point B, or if you want to go on vacation in the summer, you can literally now go down to a ticket office, pay some money, receive a piece of paper that represents all that labor of getting from one place to another. And that takes, so not only is it faster and cheaper and more comfortable, right? But it is also, it's an act of consumption rather than an act of production, if you think about it that way. And then the final thing is that you can see really, again, picking up in the 1820s, a generation of entrepreneurs in rural areas who begin to see leisure travel as an economic activity. And you can particularly see this in rural areas that either have some sort of distinctive natural feature that they think people will come to, or some sort of distinctive historical feature that they think people will come to, or in many cases in areas that like don't have a lot else going on, right? They're not good agricultural areas or things like that. And these sites, really the first place you see this is in New York and in New England, and particularly in New York, in the Hudson River Valley, in Saratoga Springs, which is a place that is literally built out of nothing around a series of mineral springs in what is otherwise a sort of sandy and unfertile part of New York State. You see it in places like Niagara Falls, right, which is, in the 1820s, pretty far away from the settled parts of the United States, but it is a kind of spectacular natural feature that people will go to see. You see it in the Hudson Valley around Revolutionary War sites, places like West Point, right? There's a thing people like to do is make a pilgrimage to the spot where Major Andre was captured, leading to the revelation of Benedict Arnold's treason. That becomes like a big tourist destination in the 1820s, right? The spot where Major Andre was captured. And you see, so a big part of this story in the early years is a very New York and secondarily sort of New England focused, right? You see it in New Hampshire in a big way in the White Mountains. Less so on the seashore, and I know this is something that you all are interested in Westport, right? That's really a later development. That's a kind of second half of the 19th century development. Before the Civil War, there's not a lot of leisure travel to beaches. That's not a thing that people seek out particularly, right? It's much more likely to be mineral springs or mountain ranges or waterfalls or other kinds of spectacular natural features or historical destinations. You see it also a little bit later picking up in the 1830s and 1840s in the South, and particularly in the mountains in Western Virginia. Similarly, there's kinds of networks of spots that are either sort of mineral springs or in some cases warm springs or hot springs that are, they're sort of in the mountains along what is now kind of the West Virginia border. Back then, that was all Virginia, of course. So you see kind of a parallel emergence of this kind of cluster of rural entrepreneurs in Virginia too. And basically what they are is they are business people who see an opportunity to make money in their rural area in a way that's not agriculture or extractive industries. And that they begin to build these kind of commercial networks of leisure destinations in that period. So, the simple answer is sort of the rise of market capitalism in the 19th century, but I mean several very specific and interlinked things when I talk about that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I would love to touch more on that sort of idea of tourism developing in these rural agricultural communities. Mm-hmm. But first, I kind of wanted to ask about something you kind of mentioned, this idea that a lot of this stuff that sort of spurred on tourism, you're talking about historic sites, natural wonders, stuff like that. In a way, people were repackaging these things and talking about them differently, which led to this sort of change. But I guess almost what I'm trying to ask is, were there people going to these things in like a proto version of tourism before it really took off in the early 1800s?
Yes, right. Yes, is the short answer, right? But I think that the cultural category of the tourist doesn't exist yet, right? And so there's not this sort of distinct group of people that's readily recognizable in culture who are kind of the consumers of these commodified means of travel and these commodified leisure destinations. So you do see, famously sort of George Washington goes and drinks the water at a set of mineral springs that they refer to as Bath. Which is now the town of Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. In a really interesting early national moment, they changed the name of Bath because Bath was being named after a kind of similar place in Britain. Right, Bath in England is a place where you go and drink the waters for health. So before the Revolution, they just named the town Bath, and after the Revolution, they rename it Berkeley Springs because they don't want that kind of association with the British anymore. So you do see that. There's another really interesting early example in Connecticut, actually, with Stafford Springs is a place where in the colonial era, sort of wealthy New Englanders are gathering to kind of drink the water. But I think it's not really a sort of commercial enterprise yet before the 1820s. Right.
So the big change is this commercialization.
Yeah, right. And I think that's, and if we're standing in the present day and looking backwards and thinking like, where does the tourist and our modern conception of the tourist come from? It's that moment, right? Mm-hmm. Not to say people didn't travel for leisure purposes before that. They did, right? But there was that much, it didn't work according to the same cultural logic that we see it now. And also it's, even in the 19th century, travel for leisure is relatively an elite experience because it's expensive, right? And more to the point, it's time consuming. Even in the era of the railroad, if you want to go, recline at the mineral springs in Western Virginia or go to Niagara Falls or visit battlefields or whatever, right? You're talking about taking weeks or potentially months away from home in order to do that. And again, that's only really the sort of wealthiest Americans that can afford to do that. You don't see kind of widespread popularization of this kind of travel till the end of the 19th century. And really, it's in a lot of ways, that's a 20th century story. But if we're talking about the older era that you're talking about, if we're going back into the colonial era, right, I think that is even more true, right? That it's a very elite group of people that have the material means. Partly it's that the travel's expensive, but really it's the time off that is the limiting factor. Most people can't be away from work for a month or two at a time, particularly in the summer, which is the intense laboring season for the vast majority of people in early America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So kind of touching again on that sort of idea of in the sort of latter half of the 19th century, these rural places on sort of the eastern seaboard, especially like in New England. So our current exhibition, Playful Passage, explores the ways that Westporters enjoyed leisure time in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And something that we found about Westport was that tourism rose because of an active choice, an entrepreneurial choice to actively endorse tourism as opposed to these traditional agricultural laboring tasks that were traditionally done in Westport before this period. There wasn't any rapid industrialization in the same way there was in somewhere like Hartford or New York City.
Right.
Did you find something similar, sort of looking at that these rural places were actively making a choice to sort of enter this tourism?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a very common phenomenon, right? And and I think in some ways what you see, you're the expert on Westport much more than me, right? But my guess is that what you're seeing in Westport at the end of the 19th century is in some ways kind of structurally similar to what's happening in a place like Saratoga Springs, New York, right, or Hot Springs, Virginia, in an earlier period, right, which is that it's a group of rural entrepreneurs who sense an opportunity here, right? But I think what you're seeing in Westport is, in the second half of the 19th century, that becomes a much bigger phenomenon as there's more and more people who are, sort of cities are growing. The number of people who work in the modern economy in such a way that they can afford to take time off is growing. And a real phenomenon you see in the Gilded Age is the rise of a sort of a modern corporate middle class. So people who are not wealthy enough to be, the owners of factories or large plantations or whatever, right? But they're also not sort of working with their hands day to day, right? That 10 to 20% of the population that's not necessarily the owners of capital, but are working in usually managerial or professional roles and are well enough compensated that they can afford to take some time in the summer, right? And particularly they can afford to take a couple of weeks here and there, right, in the summer, right? They may not be traveling in the older version of, I take the entire summer off and go around and see all the Revolutionary battlefields, right? But I might be able to take a couple weeks off in July and August and go to the seaside. And so that the emergence of that class of summer leisure travelers, I think, drives a lot of the development you're seeing in places like Westport, which are closer to major population centers and better able to cater to that kind of new middle class category of tourists, those people who could afford to get away for a week or two. So they're not going to go to Yellowstone in a week or two, right? They're gonna get out of town, try to get a little fresh air, try to get out of the suburban heat, try to partake in some of the pleasures of the countryside in the summer, right? And so you see the rise of all places like that as sort of constellations around American cities throughout, and this is very intensively so in the last couple of decades of the 19th century. And so that's not only a New York phenomenon or a New York metro area phenomenon like you would see in Westport, but you see that all over the place wherever there's sort of major modern industrial cities in the Gilded Age. So if you think about sort of the lake districts on the Illinois-Michigan border, right? There's this whole sort of area in southern Wisconsin. I'm sorry, I meant on the Illinois-Wisconsin border, right? There's a whole area in southern Wisconsin that's dotted with these little freshwater lakes, and the little resorts and little getaway communities emerge on those, and you see it, on the West Coast, on the near Seattle or San Francisco, in those emerging cities, and you see it in the South, right, in the sort of mountains of North Georgia outside of Atlanta, as Atlanta is booming and becoming a bigger city in this period. So that is not a particularly Northeastern specific story. By the time you get to the Gilded Age, this is something you see all over the place.
So it's like that rising sort of managerial middle class, especially in like these major cities where a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of this middle class is starting to appear, right?
Yeah. Right. I mean, that's where the numbers are for sure, right? I mean, that sort of emerging professional middle class exists all over the place, right? But the big concentrations of them are in these big industrial cities.
Yeah, and this is kind of I guess a side question, but so in Westport, something that's commonly known is a lot of people from larger cities will either move to Westport or have a home in Westport, almost in kind of what you said, to get away from the industrialized, especially in this sort of late 19th, early 20th century period. Would you say that this tourism industry might have led to sort of this
suburbanization sort of?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are distinct phenomena. But you're not wrong to sort of trace, I think, a kind of similar cultural logic between the two, right? And in the sense that there's both practical and cultural reasons that people romanticize rural life in sort of industrial cities in the late 19th century, right? The practical reasons is that, particularly in the summer, cities can be pretty hot and can be pretty gross and can be, subject to endemic disease and that kind of thing. So, there are like practical reasons that you would want to spend the hottest months of the year in the countryside. But also these sort of, there's long-standing cultural ideas in Western culture, going back to sort of Roman philosophers that celebrates rural life as being sort of uniquely virtuous, right? Which I think is both describes a kind of commercial leisure impulse that people have to go to resorts in the countryside, and again going back to the early 19th century, but it's also behind the whole phenomenon of essentially suburbanization, which again you put your finger on, right, is in the Gilded Age, when the actual technology that a suburban worker would use to get in and out of the city every day is likely a steam train. there's a sort of ring around major cities where that kind of life is that kind of lifestyle is kind of practical. And I'm sure Westport is in that ring as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah, but I think those are distinct things. I would distinguish between the two of them, but you're not wrong to see a kind of similar cultural logic at work there.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess we're talking about class a little bit at this point, talking about like this rising middle class, and I think something that touches on that in a really impactful way is the ways that this early form of tourism would have intersected with race and gender, because a lot of these rising middle class workers are people who are often white men, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I have a number of different things to say about that, right? First of all, if you think about the figure of the tourist as it's emerging as a result of this kind of market development, tourists get associated by the middle of the 19th century in American culture with being sort of shallow, materialistic, consumeristic, sort of deeply invested in social status or social climbing, right? I argue that the figure of the tourist is sort of emerging in culture from 1820s onwards, but by the middle of the 19th century, it's begun to take on a distinctly negative connotation. As tourists are sort of being contrasted with, sort of like true travelers who are out there and sort of, doing their own thing, breaking new paths, having true adventures, learning new knowledge, right? And so that becomes a kind of dichotomy that shapes the way a lot of people think about how you categorize different kinds of travel. And that is a dichotomy that it gets gendered, right? Because there are lots of ideas about gender in the 19th century that similarly associate women with sort of superficiality, with consumerism, right? With a sort of social ambition or social climbing, that kind of thing, particularly elite women, right? So this dichotomy, I think, plays out really differently for men and for women, right? But there's a lot of discourse in the 19th century, a lot of discussion about the idea that sort of life in these leisure destinations is overly dominated by women, right? That it is feminized. Part of that, there's a kind of demographic reason for that, because it's a not uncommon leisure pattern for this emerging kind of professional middle class, managerial class in a place like Westport, right? Is that often wives will take children and spend a longer period of time in the summer, and then husbands will kind of come and go, right, according to their work schedule. Again, you have to be pretty elite to be able to pull off a summer like that, right? This is not most people, but that's not an uncommon pattern, and I think it's one that you would definitely see in a place like Westport, right, where men are spending, sort of Friday to Monday every week in the country, right, or they're coming for a couple of weeks and then spending the rest of the time alone in the city working. And so these leisure destinations are often like demographically dominated by women. There's more women than men there. But that kind of becomes a cultural association too, right? And it's a cultural association that's used to denigrate those places, right? They are overly feminized. And I think that creates really strong, it creates, I should say, dangerous fault lines for both men and women as travelers, right? With men being tourists, right? You risk becoming framed as feminized, right? As if that makes sense, right? But in terms of like what men and women actually do, you don't actually see a huge amount of gender difference, right? Like when you step back from the level of kind of broader cultural discussions about tourism and what it means, right? Like men and women actually don't travel particularly differently, right? When you get to the question of race, though, right, that's a different question, right? In the first part of the 19th century, right, there's relatively few people of color who are wealthy enough to engage in travel anyway, right? And as a result, you don't tend to see at the beginning of the 19th century explicit racial exclusions at leisure destinations. I think mostly because I think they don't really need them, because there just aren't that many wealthy people of color who have the material resources to engage in that kind of leisure travel. Race becomes a really important fault line in national leisure travel in the 1840s, as the politics of slavery are beginning to heat up, the sectional politics of slavery are beginning to heat up between the North and the South, in the sort of lead up to the Civil War. It had been quite common for wealthy Southerners to travel to vacation destinations in the North in the first part of the 19th century, specifically to get away from the heat. And there are places in the North, right, that are kind of like known as places where Southerners congregate, right? So Newport is a place like that in the first part of the 19th century. And sometimes they're like really small and obscure, right? Clarendon Springs, Vermont, which is like a small mineral springs resort town in Vermont, right? Which is like long gone. It's not a place that really exists anymore as a tourist destination. It gets a sort of reputation as being this kind of place that Southerners go. Saratoga, similarly, right, has a lot of Southerners in it. But as the politics of slavery get more acrimonious, beginning really in the middle of the 1840s, and there are also some legal changes in the way in which northern states treat enslaved people that are brought into them in that period. It becomes more and more fraught for wealthy Southerners to travel to the North, and it particularly becomes essentially impossible for them to travel to the North and bring enslaved people with them, right? The personal servants that they might bring with them. And so the 1840s is really the decade when you see a rapid acceleration in the expansion of tourism in the South, right? And particularly those Virginia Springs, which, like I said, they have, some of them have colonial origins, right? George Washington at the Bath kind of thing. But that whole kind of constellation of mineral springs destinations that are really spread all up and down what is now the West Virginia border. They grow quite quickly in the 1840s, and it even begins to spill beyond Virginia. A great example is there's a couple of a firm of very wealthy slave traders called Franklin and Armistead, which are headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia, and New Orleans. And they basically buy a mountaintop in Tennessee and they name it Beersheba Springs. And they try to make that a kind of self-consciously Southern elite resort destination where it's not only safe to bring enslaved people with you, right, but it's safe to have kind of pro-slavery and pro-slave trade opinions, right? So the politics of race, right, really shape in the last couple of decades before the Civil War how that landscape develops. When you look after the war, though, it's really interesting, right? Particularly in the North, right? In the 1870s and the 1880s, we're beginning to enter this era that we talked about a moment ago, where the number of people who can afford to take at least a brief vacation is expanding. That group is now growing to include people of color frequently. And in the 1870s and the 1880s, there's not a ton of evidence that northern leisure destinations are strictly segregated, but that really changes in the 1890s, and it accelerates in the 1890s. There's some sort of legal reasons for that. There's some sort of constitutional reasons that undergird the emergence of what historians have called de facto segregation, though I think that's like not necessarily a great term, so you begin to see Black leisure travelers, right, and Black vacationers being increasingly pushed out of white vacation destinations quite aggressively in the 1890s. And as a result, you see the rise of specifically African-American vacation destinations, right, that they begin to create their own African-American travelers. And again, these are wealthier African-Americans begin to create their own vacation destinations where they can kind of travel and spend the summer, free of the indignities of segregation. So Oak Bluff, which is in Martha's Vineyard, right? Becomes one. There's an extremely elite Black resort in Michigan called Idlewild, which is basically like a lake that a developer builds sort of houses around this lake, and it becomes like a leisure destination for sort of the Black elite from Chicago, and that's in northern Michigan. In Maryland, there's a development called Chesapeake Beach, which is I think it's actually established, I believe, by Frederick Douglass's son. So it's sort of for members of sort of Black elite classes of DC and Baltimore mostly are the ones who are vacationing there. So you see this kind of like emergence of a kind of parallel series of destinations that emerge under the conditions of segregation. And there's a very similar historical trajectory and a very similar on a very similar timeline for Jewish Americans. That there's a real rise of kind of public anti-Semitism in the 1890s, and resorts and vacation destinations that had been open to Jewish Americans before that begin to exclude them formally. The sort of most famous example, and this attracts quite a bit of controversy, is Melville Dewey, right, who's the inventor of the Dewey Decimal System. That's how we know him, right? Who is the state librarian for the state of New York. He establishes a resort in the Adirondacks called the Lake Placid Club, and the Lake Placid Club in the early 1890s, like famously puts up signs on its entrance post that says "No Hebrews." And this becomes a big kind of political thing in New York because prominent Jewish New Yorkers try to get Melville Dewey fired as the state librarian of New York as a result of it. But this kind of thing is happening all over the place. This is just the most famous example because it kind of turns into a bit of a political struggle in New York. Because Dewey has this kind of public position. And so what you see then is that Jewish Americans similarly creating their own networks of vacation destinations, leisure destinations, particularly in the Southern Catskills, right? The area that becomes known kind of colloquially in the 20th century as the Borscht Belt. But that has its origins in the 1890s as a place where Jewish Americans could sort of go and spend the summer vacation and leisure without having to deal with the indignities of sort of overt anti-Semitism, which was increasingly prevalent in existing resorts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So while this might be a little bit out of the scope of selling the sites, how would you say sort of more recently, this mass adoption of internet and more recently social media has kind of changed American tourism? Because I mean, we see the rise of people advertising tourism, social media, kind of the decline of travel agencies planning vacations and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that what it is just I see similar dynamics just shifting in a different media environment, right? Which is to say, there have always been essentially economic actors. I should say always since the 1820s, there have been economic actors who are looking to figure out how to package and commodify vacation experiences and sell them to a market of potential vacationers. And that looks like tourist guidebooks, printed on newspaper in the 1820s. It looks like kind of commercially produced books in the second half of the 19th century. It looks like travel agents in the 20th century. And it looks like sort of internet entrepreneurs in the 21st century. So in some ways, I think it's a kind of similar dynamic, just being played in a different medium. And another thing that I pay a lot of attention to in my research is the way that travelers and tourists articulate their experiences to their own kind of home audiences, right? Family, friends, communities, however they conceive of those things, and the way in which they talk about those travel experiences as a way to kind of construct their own identities through that, right? And that's what social media is, right? So what appeared in diaries and letters and newspaper columns in the 19th century now appears on Instagram, right? But and so obviously the specifics are incredibly different because the underlying media technology is incredibly different. But I think it's a similar kind of cultural dynamic at play there.
Yeah. So we kind of touched on this a little earlier, talking about that sort of idea of this different kinds of travel, like this explorer travel versus this tourist travel. And I'm kind of interested in the difference between this, I guess you could almost call it guided versus independent tourism, though they might not want to call it independent tourism. In the early years of the industry, did like the planning industry in travel rise in response to an interest in tourism, or is it more pushed by these industries?
I think it's both, right? But I think the important thing about that dynamic, right, the idea that we have sort of tourists on the one hand who are kind of silly and superficial and materialistic and unoriginal and trite and all those things, right? And then we have sort of like true travelers on the other hand who are adventurous and thoughtful and pioneering and innovative and producing true knowledge about the world. I think that the key insight that I would share about that, right, is that those two categories are always being constituted in relationship to each other. So before we get the kind of commercial in leisure industries, whether it's publishing or transportation or these sort of rural entrepreneurs that produce this figure of the tourist, people didn't spend a lot of time running around trying to prove that their travel was somehow true and legitimate, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that these categories really only exist in opposition to each other, right? Rather than being sort of pre-existing categories, right? Does it make sense?
Yeah. So kind of like the idea of being a tourist before being a tourist wasn't an idea, if you will.
Right. Yeah. Tourist comes to be the label that people apply to people who are kind of consuming these culture industry products, right? And then you get right in that same moment other people who are like, I don't want to think of myself as just a mere consumer of cultural industry products. That I am my own person, right? And the way they frame that can work really differently. Also, I think really fraught in terms of how men and women can navigate that divide, right? Women often have to turn to things like, well, I'm not a tourist because I'm educating my children and exposing them to the world, right? Whereas men can spend a lot of time like writing lengthy journal entries about the geology of the land they're passing through, which gives them some sort of like claim to scientific credibility or something like that, right? So the way in which that happens, I think, is actually profoundly shaped by gender. But that makes sense as a kind of reaction against, no, I'm not a mere consumer of these cultural industry products. I am something more, more individual and autonomous and unique.
Yeah. So you obviously know a great deal about this topic. And so during the research for this book, Selling the Sights, what did you find most surprising based on what you'd already known about the topic?
I was surprised. So that reaction I talked about a moment ago, where there are people who sort of strongly react against the idea that they're tourists, right? And want to think of themselves as true travelers in a more authentic sense. I saw that in people's letters and diaries and that kind of thing first. So I understood on some level that dynamic, right? Those categories that are being created in relationship to each other were shaping people's experience. Like I sort of got that from just reading the accounts of people who had traveled. One thing that surprised me as I dug into it a little bit more is the extent to which there were actually whole categories of people who were trying to routinize and systemize that process. And this is something it's happening both in Britain and the United States, right? That there are scientists, or there are sort of like travel writers, people who are writing these guides about how to be a true and authentic traveler. What are the things you need to pay attention to, right? What are the things you should be trying to learn? What should your relationship be like with the people who you're traveling through, right? The people you meet on your travel, right? Even if you look at the British example, right? The Royal Society in the beginning of the 1840s is putting out guides every year to travelers to say, here's the pieces of information that we would like you to collect. So if you want to go and be a real, meaningful, authentic traveler, and you're going to Europe, like take these climactic measurements every day and record them and give them to us when you get back, right? Because we're trying to build, sort of a database of climate data about, they don't use the term database, right? But functionally what they're trying to do is create a kind of archive of climate data. And so that they're actually there are actors out there who are trying to teach people how to do this, right? Including some really important and prominent women, right? Most famously, Harriet Martineau, who's a travel writer and a kind of, she's often sort of thought of as the mother of sociology, right? Someone who's studying the structures of societies that she travels through, and she writes this guide called How to Observe, in which she basically argues that women make better travelers than men because they are better able to access the kind of interior social and emotional lives of the people who they encounter on their travels, and therefore can more insightfully report this kind of like what you might think of as almost a kind of proto-sociological or proto-anthropological study, right, that is deriving from their travel, right? So there's all sorts of people who are like purporting to teach you how to do this, which was something that surprised me because I saw that in the lived experiences of the travelers first, and it wasn't until later that I was like, oh, wait, there are actually people who are trying to teach them how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I guess we've touched a lot on sort of this idea of the differences between how travel was viewed for people of different sections of society, whether it be race, class, or gender.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, so we kind of talked a little bit about how,
Mm-hmm.
especially after the Civil War and towards the 20th century, there was a rising Black middle class and
Mm-hmm.
middle class of color who were more and more experiencing tourism and contributing to the tourism industry. So in a way, it became more equitable or more available, I suppose. But
Yeah, segregated.
segregated, certainly, yes.
Increasingly segregated in the Gilded Age, yeah.
Are there ways, so since then, I'm sure there's ways travel has become more equitable, but are there ways it's become less equitable over time?
Oh, geez. Yeah, less equitable. So this is well beyond the scope of what I've worked on directly.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say my sort of gut answer to your question is that when these sort of dynamics of commercialization and commodification of experience begin to jump international lines, and particularly begin to spread to places that are significantly less wealthy than the United States, which is something that I think is largely a 20th century phenomenon and largely a kind of second half of the 20th century phenomenon, that you get new forms of inequities that are very real material inequities across international lines. So I'm thinking about the rise of things like resort tourism in the Caribbean or Mexico or Latin America more broadly. Or I'm thinking about tourism in Southeast Asia, something like that, right? That I think that there are new kinds of inequities that emerge. That was a dynamic that was there in the 19th century, right? Oftentimes these rural areas that people are visiting are less wealthy than the people who are visiting them, right? But I think that gap in the second half of the 20th century is really growing as these kinds of these commercial industries that create vacation destinations are really going global, right? So I would say that, yeah.
So now we're going to open up some questions for the audience. So if anyone would like to submit questions through the comment feature, you can feel free to do that now. But we do also have a few that were submitted beforehand.
Okay.
We'll get into those now. So the first question is, how long did it take you to write your book, Selling the Site?
This is an embarrassing question because I sort of was starting the process around like 2005, 2006 in graduate school, right? And the book came out in 2019, so a dozen years, right, start to finish. But I was doing a million other things in that time too, right? And building a career as a working academic. But yeah, and the question I hear behind that question, right, is how long did it take you to get to the core ideas, right? And that did take me a long time, right? In the sense that when you think about writing a dissertation in graduate school, right, you are writing for a very narrow audience, which is a committee of 3 or 4 professionally trained historians. And you're writing for them with a very particular goal in mind, which is to show that you have strong enough command of this material that you sort of get to join their club, right, of having a PhD. And almost nobody outside of that world wants to read what you write in that context, right? Because it's written with a very particular purpose in mind. So then it took me a long time then after graduate school and a lot of talking to public audiences and a lot of sharing my work and a lot of honestly teaching undergraduates, right, to really fully understand what it is my research, what the stakes were of my research to people who are, a broader public, right? If that makes sense. And that it was, that part took me a really long time, right? Which is, I think, accounts for a lot of those years in the middle there. And it took me engaging in all kinds of other work as a historian, right? Talking to the public, teaching students, right? To get out of that headspace of, trying to be a new member of the club, showing my bona fides, to be a member of the club, to being like, no, I'm, a historian who wants to share knowledge about the past with people who are interested, but are not, sort of like members of this club in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our second question is, when did international tourism really take off?
That is more of a slow boil, right? I mean, if you go back to the period I'm talking about, right, there are Americans who are traveling, particularly to Europe. But that is, I said a moment ago, right, that taking the summer off to go visit Mineral Springs or Niagara Falls or Revolutionary War battlefield sites was a pretty elite phenomenon in the first part of the 19th century. But to go to Europe was an even more elite phenomenon, right? Because then you're talking about, travel time, the sheer transatlantic travel time, often in the weeks or months, right? Depending on weather and that kind of thing. And then once you get to Europe, right, once you've undertaken such a long journey, right, people stay for, sometimes like a year to make it worth it. And it's common in that period that the Americans who are engaging in leisure travel in Europe are people who have other reasons to be there, right? Whether they're business reasons or diplomatic reasons a lot of the time, right? So, it's the kind of thing that it's pretty rare for people to go to Europe just for pure leisure purposes. The emergence of transatlantic steam travel in the middle of the 19th century opens that circle up significantly, right? Mostly because it makes the transatlantic voyage quicker, but also more reliable. Like, how long it's going to take more or less in a steamboat, as opposed to a sailing ship where, it could be weeks or it could be months, right? So that kind of reliability and the speed, opens up a much wider group of Americans who could travel overseas. And so there's a story of relative democratization in the second half of the 19th century in international travel, similar to the one that I was telling a moment ago about kind of domestic travel. But again, it remains a more elite phenomenon because you have to be richer and you have to have more time. And then I think the real meaningful step change after that is war, right? Which is weird to think about that, right? But if you think about the armies, the U.S. armies in Europe, particularly in the aftermath of World War I, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, right? That becomes an opportunity for a lot of just sort of common everyday Americans to engage in leisure travel around Europe, right? And particularly when the war is over, and particularly in World War II, right? The U.S. Army stays and occupies large swaths of Europe for, a decade, and then, all the way through to the present day, right? And that's not a full-time job, right? So those soldiers are getting to engage in leisure travel around Europe on their days off and their weeks off and things like that, right? So that's a really important moment, I think, where kind of everyday Americans are getting to engage in overseas leisure travel. And then there's a big step change, I think, when you begin to talk about more affordable transatlantic aviation in the second half of the 20th century, right? The real impediment to that overseas travel is both cost and particularly time, and that helps, transatlantic aviation, jet planes in the 60s, and particularly as they become more affordable towards the closing decades of the 20th century. That's really important, right, for enabling overseas travel.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you so much for sharing so much of this very interesting information with us today. And I would just like to ask you one more question before we finish off today. Is there anything you'd like to share about any upcoming projects or work you're doing?
I mean, my work right now is going in a very, very different direction. I've published a few smaller things about tourism and leisure and travel since the book, but I'm sort of closing that chapter of my scholarly life a little bit, mostly because I've said everything that I really have to say about it at this point.
Yeah.
And my work right now, I'm actually working on a book about a gang of horse thieves that sort of the peak of their career was in the 1840s through the 1860s in upstate New York. But they ran this kind of criminal network that's extended from New England, right, from Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, west into Ohio, south into Pennsylvania, up and north into Ontario. They cross the international border. And I'm working on this book that's not only exploring their story, because it's a fascinating story, and they are, I was going to say lovable bad guys, but they aren't even all that lovable. They're just kind of guys. They're not actually all that lovable, but they're just kind of jerks. But exploring their story, and then also kind of tracing their story forward into the 20th century. Because one thing that really interests me about their story is how much it changes over time, the way in which people tell their story, and various characters kind of rise and fall in significance. And so really thinking about them as a way in which, as a tool in which people are kind of thinking about local identity. So this project is taking me much more, not only into kind of crime, and that kind of crime and punishment, right, which is, I think, an interesting theme in the 19th century. Still engaging with a lot of those questions that I'm interested in about capitalism and capitalist modernity, because these guys are very much sort of, they're highly organized. They borrow a lot of forms of modern corporate organization in the 19th century. And then also questions about sort of local historical production, memory creation, that kind of thing, the ways in which people engage with the stories of the regions that they live in, and how they tell those stories and retell them through time in ways that, really reflect, I think, what they're concerned about in the moment. Right? Yeah.
Well, that sounds super interesting, and I'll certainly myself be eagerly awaiting whatever you produce next.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you one more time for joining us today at the Westport Museum, and I would like to thank our audience so much for joining us today and learning a little bit more about tourism and the rise of tourism in the United States. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah. Bye.